CARO-KANN Fantasy variation. On this tape we're going to examine the F3 Caro, sometimes known as the fantasy variation. The position arises after the initial moves 1. E4, C6, D4, D5 and now 3 pawn to F3. This will be the position in diagram 1. You may think that F3 is a very strange move as it deprives the knight of the square, but the move is in fact very logical. If white wants to maintain his centre with the pawns on E4 and D4 against a caro, this is the only way he can achieve it. But the system also has other advantages which are very real in serious games. Firstly, there is hardly any theory on this line at all. Most references give about 5 moves and say that black is equalised. This is a very superficial judgment, however, and in my opinion black has to play very accurately to equalise, if he can at all. The other main advantage of this line is that a player who plays a caro is usually not prepared for the dynamic positions that arise out of this system. So if you now set up the position in diagram 1, black has to decide what he is going to do. We shall look at his 3 main moves, which are E6, G6 and D takes E4. So first of all we shall look at D takes E4. White now recaptures, F takes E4, and black's only logical follow-up now is to play pawn to E5. And white now replies knight to F3. Obviously D takes E5 is ridiculous, as after queen H4 check white is completely lost. So knight to F3. Black now has played 2 moves in this position. First one we should look at is E takes D4, which is a very dubious reputation, but it is the move that is often met over the board. From experience, players seem to play this move instantly, and after white's very strong reply, 6 bishop to C4, they sink into deep thought for about 20 minutes before realising how bad their position is. We're now going to look at some games to show how dangerous white's attack really is. First game we shall look at is Gallagher Lee from Chelmsford 1984, where black continued with bishop to B4 check. After this move black is completely lost. White now replies C3. Now black's best in this position is to retreat his bishop to E7 or D6, when white will take on D4 with a pawn, have complete control of the centre, a big lead in development and an open F file. If this is black's best, you can see how bad his position is already. Anyway, in the game Lee played D takes C3, and they now followed bishop takes F7 check. Now if black plays king to E7, white will play queen to B3, and after C takes B2 check, queen takes B4 check, king takes F7 and bishop takes B2, the rest will just be a matter of time. So if you now return to the position in diagram 2, instead of playing king to E7, black tried king takes F7. White now played queen takes D8, and black played C takes B2 check. And white played king to E2, and black played B takes A1, gaining a new queen. So in this position white is a rook and a piece down, but it's his turn to move, and after knight to G5 check, black's now forced to play king to G6 and queen to E8 check. White forces mate. Black resigned in this position. After king to F6, rook F1 is mate, and after king h6, knight e6, discovered check, g5, bishop takes g5 is mate. So I hope this game convinces you that black cannot treat this variation too lightly. So if you now go back to diagram 1 and add the moves d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, knight to f3, e takes d4 and bishop to c4, black has a number of defensive tries apart from playing bishop b4 check. One of them is to play bishop e7, attempting to castle quickly and to prevent knight to g5. The game Gallagher-Georgiou Highbury 1984 was over rather quickly after bishop to e7, castles, knight to f6, now knight to g5, castles, pawn to e5. Now black played bishop to g4, and after queen to d3 he resigned. However, if he placed the bishop back on c8 and the queen on d1, black is already lost in this position. His only other knight move is knight to d5, and white plays queen to h5 with a double attack on h7 and f7, making black's only move bishop takes g5. White plays bishop takes g5. Black moves his queen, maybe to b6, and now white just plays bishop to d3, threatening mate on h7, and after h6, white will play bishop takes h6, and his attack will storm through. And if he plays g6 instead, white plays queen to h6, and follows up next move with bishop to f6, and mates on g7. Unless black gives up a piece on f6, he'll probably have to play something like knight to d7 and take twice on f6. So if you go back to diagram 1 again, add the moves d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, knight to f3, e takes d4, bishop to c4. Another try from black has been to play bishop to e6 in this position. White now plays bishop takes e6, f takes e6, and in this position simply castles. There's no hurry to try and get any of black's weak pawns back yet, and just get the king into safety and take the open f-file. Black now has a bit of a problem here. The game Gallagher-Smith, London 1983, continued knight to d7, knight to g5, knight gf6, knight takes e6, queen to a5, bishop to f4, and black now came up with the startling king f7. But after knight g5 check, king to g8. And now, in this position, white should have played pawn to c3, threatening mates with queen b3 and also to recapture his pawn on d4 with a completely winning position. Instead, queen d3 occurred in the game and white won after a long endgame. The rest of the game is given in the notes. Black has a few other defensive tries after 6 bishop to c4 in this line, but none of them are sufficient. I recommend that you study the position you're at home and convince yourself of the strength of white's attack after, say, 6 knight to d7 or 6 knight to f6, remembering that it is based on the f7 square and can be helped by moves such as knight to g5 or pawn to e5 to drive a knight away from f6. So, if you now go back to diagram 1 and add the moves d takes e4, f takes e4, e5, knight to f3, We shall look at a much safer move for black in this position, which all the books give as equal, but I think white can retain the advantage. Black now plays 5 bishop to e6. White cannot now win a pawn with knight takes e5 because of queen to h4 check. So instead, white should just support his centre with pawn to c3. The play in this line is now based around black trying to hold his grip on the centre. If he is forced to play e takes d4 without any immediate counterplay, he will be in a very bad way. In the next few moves, black overprotects his e5 square and white attacks the pawn as many times as possible. We shall now look at the game Gallagher-Lyle Chelmsford Open 1984, which continued after 6 c3 with 6 knight to f6 from black. White now played bishop to d3 and black played knight bd7. It would be bad now for white to play d takes e5, as after knight to g4 black wins his pawn back with a better game. So if he placed the pawns back on d4 and e5 and the black knight on f6, white played 8 queen to e2. Black played bishop to d6 and white castled. Black continued his plan with queen to c7. White now played 10 knight bd2 and black castled queenside. We have now reached a position where the textbooks finish with the assessment equals. I think this game proves that white has the advantage. He now played 11 knight to c4, which increases the pressure on e5. Now black had a choice. He could try rook h e8, when white has then two moves. First of all, he could swap all the pieces on e5 and continue with bishop to f4, when I think he is slightly better. You can look at this at home. Or he could instead, after rook h e8, play bishop to g5, increasing the pressure again. However, in the game, if he placed the black rook back on h8, black played 11 bishop to g4. And white now continued with 12 pawn to h3. Black played bishop to h5. And white now played the very useful queen c2, which unpins the knight as well as defending the e-pawn from behind the bishop so that it won't be pinned after black plays rook h e8. Anyway, black continued rook h e8 anyway, and white now played 14 bishop to g5. Black now has virtually run out of useful waiting moves. If he plays king to b8, then white can take everything on e5, and at the end bishop f4 will win. So in this position, white is already threatening to play bishop takes f6, when black would have to recapture with a pawn. So black now played bishop takes f3, white played rook takes f3, and black played pawn to h6. White continued bishop to e3. Black now played king to b8. White played pawn to a4. And black now played c5. And after d5, white had a tremendous game. The rest of this is given in the notes, with some more examples of this line where black adopts a different piece setup in the opening, but it seems to me that white gains an advantage in every line. Right. So if you now return to the position in diagram 1 again, we shall now look at the move 3g6 for black. If you just place the white pawn back on f2 and place the white knight on c3, we've reached a position from the Gallagher system of the modern defence. Right? I don't think white has ever played 4f3 in this position. So a lot of people will play 3g6 thinking that f3 is bad. In fact, I think it's probably the best move in this position. So if you just put the knight back on b1, the pawn on f3, white will play 4 knight to c3. So after knight to c3, black plays bishop to g7. And now white plays bishop to e3. Firstly, we should look at the game Gallagher, Yarner, Miles, Lloyds Bank Masters 1984, which continued after bishop to e3 with d takes e4. This seems to me like a very dubious idea. Black should try to keep the centre closed and not give white a free hand. After white recaptured with f takes e4, the plan was continued with knight to h6. The idea is to harass the bishop on e3 with knight to g4 and then play for e5. However, it can be never quite arranged. Play continued 7 knight to f3, knight to g4, and now bishop to g5. This is the strongest place for the bishop, pinning the e-pawn, so preventing black from playing an immediate e5. So black now continued h6, and white retreated his bishop to h4. And black played knight to e3. And white played queen to d2. At first glance you might think that bishop takes d4 is a strong move in this position, as after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, black cannot capture on d4 because of knight takes c2 check, winning the queen back and 2 pawns up. So if you just place the black bishop back on g7, pawn on d4, queens back on d2 and d8, and the knight on e3. After bishop takes d4, white wins with bishop to f2. You can check this at home for yourself, but black loses a piece in all variations. So after queen to d2, black played knight takes f1, and white took that with a rook. Although black has the 2 bishops in this position, he has paid a very high price for it. 4 moves have been made with a knight to capture an unmoved bishop, and consequently white has an enormous lead in development. Black should now think about getting castled as quickly as possible and consoling herself to a defensive game. However, black played 11 queen to a5, white played 12 castles queenside, and now black played bishop to e6, which was met by the strong reply 13 d5. If now black plays bishop takes c3, white recaptures with the pawn, and after queen takes a2, he wins with queen to d4. So if you place the white knight back on c3, pawn on a2 and b2, black bishop on g7 and queen on a5, and the white queen on d2, black played the move bishop to g4 in the game. White now attacked the bishop with queen to f4. Now if black plays bishop takes c3, white will play queen takes g4 with the double threat of b takes c3 and queen to c8 check. So if you replace the pieces again with the bishop on g7, knight on c3 and queen on white queen on f4 and the other bishop on g4. Instead, black played pawn to h5. Now white started an amazing combination with 15 knight to e5. Black's reply is now forced due to the enormous threats to the f7 square, so black played bishop to h6. White played bishop to g5. And now bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. Black now is committed to taking the rook. I mean, if he castles, white can play knight takes g4 and win a pawn if he wants. He might have something stronger than that as well. So, black played bishop takes d1. If white now plays rook takes f7, then black can defend with queen to c5, and it is not clear that white is winning. However, in the game, white played 18 d6, forcing black to take on d6, as he's threatening mate there, which cannot be avoided apart from that. So, e takes d6, and now white continued with 19 knight to d5 to cut black's connections along his fourth rank. White is threatening mate on e7 again, and if black plays 19 queen to d8, then after knight to f6 check, there are going to be some very nasty discovered checks. You can analyse this line at home. All lines win for white. So if you place the queen back on a5 and the knight on d5, black continued with c takes d5, and only now white played rook takes f7. Now if black plays queen to d8, queen takes g6 leads to mate. Black tried 20 knight to c6, and now 21 queen to f6, and black resigned. White threatens queen takes h8 mate, as well as queen e6 check and queen d7. Both threats cannot be stopped. So if you go back to diagram 1, we should now look at some lighter stuff. You add the moves 3 g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, and bishop to e3. We shall look at the game Hodgson-Arkle British Championship 1984, where black continued with another dubious idea of 5 knight to a6. White now played bishop takes a6, and black b takes a6. It is not so much black's busted pawn structure that gives him a bad game, but his lack of counterplay on the queen side, where white will simply play b3. Hodgson's play in this game makes it look as though black is already lost. The game continued queen to d2, rook to b8, pawn to b3, queen to a5, knight ge2, d takes e4, f takes e4, knight to f6, pawn to e5, knight to d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d2 check, king takes d2, c takes d5, knight to f4, bishop to b7, and 15 knight to d3. It is obvious that white has a fantastic game. The rest of this game is given in the notes. So if you return to position diagram 1 again, I had the moves 3 g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, bishop to e3, we have to try and find a decent plan for black. He doesn't want to play knight f6 yet because e5 gains a tempo, and he doesn't want to play h5 because the white's pawn hasn't been committed to e5 yet. Possibly he can play 5 knight f6, 6 e5, knight g8, followed by h5, knight h6 and knight to f5. I think this plan is rather dubious though, as he's a tempo down on the similar line from the modern defence, and also he still hasn't solved the problems of his queen bishop. So I've come to the conclusion that black stands considerably worse here, and I think his best plan is to play b6 and bishop a6 to stop off his bad bishop and adopt a very solid setup which will be extremely difficult to crack. So if you now go back to the position in diagram 1, we should look at black's best reply to the fantasy variation, 3e6. Black gets a firm hold in the centre and will not want to release it without a very good reason. White now plays 4 bishop to e3, offering a pawn, as after d takes e4, white cannot really recapture because of queen h4 check, although I have tried this on one occasion. Didn't work out too successfully. So instead white should play 5 knight to d2, and after black takes on f3, white recaptures with a knight from g1. You may ask what compensation that white has for his sacrificed pawn. Well, first of all, he has a big lead in development, and he has an open f-file, and also he has the e5 square, which is going to be very useful. Also, black's position is very passive, with his pawns on c6 and e6. All is not gloom, however, for black. He will be playing to break out with c5 at some stage, and if he does survive the white pressure, he is after all a pawn up. Play might continue along the lines 6 knight to f6 from black, knight to c4, and now bishop to e7. If instead of this move, black plays knight to d5 as recommended in the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, white plays bishop to d2, and he will follow up by playing his knight from c4 to e5 and then playing c4 and bishop to c3, where it appeared that black's knight to d5 gained time. It's actually driven white's bishop to its ideal square and gained time with c4 as well. So knight to d5 would be a mistake. So if you go back to the position where you played bishop e7 rather than knight d5, I think white should then follow up with bishop to d3 and queen to e2. I prefer castling queenside as a deterrent to black's break with c5. I think if you spend some time analysing this gambit at home, you'll feel confident, because it causes a lot of problems over the board. One very good thing in its favour is that Smyslov played it for about 5 years in the 50s. Alright. I don't think Smyslov would have played it without analysing it in great depth and convincing himself that it was sound. So, if you go back to the position in diagram 1 again and add the moves e6 for black and bishop to e3 for white. I've never actually faced d takes e4 over the board. More popular is for queen to b6. When white should make no attempt to keep his b pawn and play instead 5 knight to d2. In the game Gallagher, Sugden, Hastings, 1984, black grabbed a pawn with 5 queen takes b2, and white now played 6 bishop to d3. Black played knight to f6. White played e5, Black played knight fd7. White now played 8 knight to e2. Black played pawn to c5. White now supported the centre with 9 c3. And black played 9 queen to a3, threatening to take on d4 because of the pins on the bishops. So now white played 10 knight to b1. In the game, black actually played in this position queen to a5. White played castles. Black played pawn to c4. And after bishop to c2, position is reached where white has excellent compensation for the pawn. The rest of the game is given in the notes. However, if you go back to the position before knight to b1, so if you go back to after black played queen to a3, which is the position in diagram 3, white played knight to b1. Now black could play queen to b2. Unfortunately, white has no choice but to repeat with 11 knight to d2. I thought about sacrificing a rook in the corner, but you can analyse this for yourself, and there's no way to trap the queen, and it leads to nothing. So if you return to diagram 1 and add the moves e6, bishop to e3, queen to b6, knight to d2, queen takes b2, bishop to d3, and knight to f6, maybe a better try for white is to play 8 knight to e2 instead of pawn to e5, preparing to castle as quickly as possible. If black tries to take advantage of this with 7 d takes e4, f takes e4, knight to g4, white now plays bishop to f4. Black can now try pawn to e5, and white should reply 10 knight to c4. Queen to b4 check would now be a mistake because of c3, but instead black should play bishop to b4 check, and white must play king to f1. And it appears that the black queen is trapped, but it is a resource with 11 e takes f4. And now white must take on b2. Knight takes b2. Black plays knight to e3 check. White plays 13 king to f2. Black plays knight takes d1. And white takes back with the rook from a1. Rook a takes d1. We reach a position where white has compensation for his pawn. So if you now return to diagram 1 and add the moves 3 e6, 4 bishop to e3, queen to b6, and then knight to d2. Of course black doesn't have to grab the b pawn, but can continue positionally with 5 pawn to c5. Well, it seems to me that white's best is to play d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, and now not knight to b3, as after queen to e3 check it will be white left with the isolated pawn. So if you just put the pieces back with the knight on d2, queen on c5, but white should first play e takes d5. Now if black recaptures with the pawn, white has a definite slight advantage after playing knight to b3. However, if instead black takes back with a queen, white can gain the initiative, maybe quite a dangerous one, with knight to c4, and black has to always worry about d6 square, and white has a leading development and also a permanent advantage with a queenside pawn majority. So if you return to diagram 1 again, another way of black playing is to transpose into the French defence. So if you add the moves bishop to e6 for black, bishop to e3 for white. Now black can play knight to f6. And white plays 5, pawn to e5, knight fd7, and 6, pawn to f4. Although white has wasted a tempo with f3 and f4, there is no way that black can play this position without c5, so the tempo losses are cancelled out. After 6, c5, white plays 7, knight to f3, black knight to c6, knight c6. White could now try pawn to c3 supporting the centre, but I prefer to play knight to c3. When black captures on d4, white will like to take back with pieces so that he can use this square as a base for a later attack. Often you'll reach endgames where white has a knight on d4 against a white squared bishop from black, and these endings are often clearly winning. After knight to c3, black's most common reply is to play queen to b6. Well, now white plays knight to a4. Black plays queen to a5 check. White plays c3. If black were now to play c4, this would be very anti-positional, as he would release all pressure on the centre and also commit his queen's bishop to a life of total inactivity. So, the normal move here is to play c takes d4. If white now innocently recaptures on d4, with knight takes d4, black plays knight takes d4, white plays bishop takes d4 or queen takes d4, and black then wins a piece with pawn to b5. So if you reset the pieces, putting the black pawns back on d4 and b7, white knight on f3, bishop on e3, and a black knight on c6. White must first of all, after c takes d4, play pawn to b4. Now black has a choice of retreating his queen or playing a very interesting piece sacrifice with knight takes b4. White must take this with cb4. Black plays bishop takes b4 check. Now white must play bishop to d2. Black takes on d2, bishop takes d2, and white plays knight takes d2. So if you look at this position, black has 3 pawns for his piece, but one of his pawns on d4 looks likely to drop off in the near future. However, he's going to have chances with an f6 break of getting a big pawn roller in the centre. In this position I prefer for white, but black is certainly not without its chances. Play might continue with black castling, white playing bishop to d3, and black now playing pawn to f6. Be now bad for white to play queen h5, as black would simply reply with pawn to f5, and then white's pieces on the queen side are left on pre, so he'd probably have to bring his queen back to d1, next move to defend them all. Then black has gained time to launch and play on the queen side. Maybe he can play with b6 and bishop a6, or maybe b5, b4, and then bishop to a6, trying to swap off his problem piece. Also, he might be able to play his queen into c3 to cause some confusion at the right moment. But white is a piece up after all, and he does deserve to have a few problems. I would prefer to play white in this position. So, instead of sacrificing a piece on b4, if you return to the position in diagram 4, black instead could just retreat his queen back to c7. And white will now play knight takes d4. And black can play pawn to a6, preventing anything from coming into b5. And also setting a cunning trap. If white now continues innocently with bishop to d3, black plays pawn to b5, white plays knight to b2, and black now plays knight c takes e5. White plays pawn takes knight, and black continues with queen takes c3 check. White now must interpose his queen d2, and black plays bishop takes b4. So he already has 3 pawns for his piece. He's about to pick up a 4th one on e5, as well as having strong threats such as queen takes b2 and queen to c5. White probably has to play king e2, and black could just take on e5, or he could swap queens off and play an excellent endgame with an enormous centre and 4 pawns for the piece. So if you return to diagram 4 and add the moves for black, queen c7, knight takes d4 for white, and a6 for black, white should play queen to d2, keeping everything under control. In this position, white has a definite advantage due to his vice-like grip on the d4 square. b5 will now not do black much good, as white can just come back to b2 as the c3 square is defended, and he can either leave his knight there, or he can cover in the c4 square, which is his only weakness, or he can play his knight to d3 and try and come into c5 in some lines by retreating his knight from d4 to b3. Or also he can just play his bishop to d3, castle short, and just play for an attack with f5 at some stage. If black ever exchanges knights on d4 with knight takes d4, white recaptures with the bishop, and then he's defending his e-pawn, and f5 will probably come very quickly with devastating strength. So I think white has a very good position here, and practice has proved that black really does struggle on this line. So if you go back to diagram 1, we should look at another line for black. So after the moves e6 for black, bishop to e3, knight to f6, pawn to e5, knight fd7, pawn to f4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, knight to c3. The game Gallagher, Islington 1983 continued with c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now queen to b6. Okay, white could now try knight to f5, but this isn't a very strong move, as black can choose between queen takes b2 and bishop to c5, which both appear to give him a good game. You can analyse this for yourself at home. In the game, white played queen to d2. Black now took the pawn on b2. White now does have serious threats of moving his knight somewhere nasty with a discovery on the black queen. So queen takes b2 was played. White now played rook to b1. And black played queen to a3. If now white plays knight db5, then black will retreat his queen to a5, defending c7 square, and it's not clear how much. White obviously has some sort of compensation, but it's not clear it is enough. Another try for white, instead of knight db5, would be knight cb5, when black would counter-attack with queen takes a2, and then after rook b3 maybe he can play a move like king to d8, defending the square on c7. The king's actually quite safe in the middle, and this position is totally unclear. However, in the game, white played a much stronger move than either of the knights into b5, and that is bishop to b5. Well, threatening immediately to win with taking on c6. Black now played knight takes d4. And white recaptured with bishop takes d4. So if black now played, say, pawn to a6, white can get his pawn back with a better game by bishop takes d7 check, unless black decides to capture with a king, which would be extremely dangerous. So in this position, black decided to get his king out of the centre and castle as quickly as possible with bishop to e7. White now castled, and black also castled. And now white played knight takes d5 in this position. Black had to take the knight with e takes d5, and white now played rook to b3, attacking the black queen, which is only one move. Queen takes a2, and now white completed the combination with rook to a1. Well, black is now forced to play queen takes one of the rooks. He took the one on a1 so that he could take the bishop out of the game or drive it back for a while. Bishop takes a1. And now after knight to c5, black actually developed some compensation, and the game went on to be a draw. Instead of winning the black queen with knight takes d5, white should have played f5 first, when the threat of knight takes d5 is now very real, and also the threat of f6 with a very, very strong mating attack. And black is probably completely lost. I mean, white has only given up a pawn for this tremendous position.
On side 2 of this tape, as a special bonus, we're going to go through some of the recent developments in audio chess openings, such as the St. George, the Taylor's variation, the French, and of course the Bishop E2 Sicilian. Now, the St. George I played in the last British Championship, and took a rather heavy beating. I had a pretty bad score as black. We want to look and see if the opening stood up, or whether it was the person using it who just didn't stand up. Now we'll look at the gambit line, which was Chandler Basman. This began e4, e6, d4, a6, c4, b5. And in this case, white took c takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5. Black went bishop to b7, and Chandler played knight c3. This is one of the possible moves, but in some ways it helps black. Black plays bishop b4. Chandler here played queen e2. This is similar to a game which was published in chess, and I've forgotten who my opponent was, but it was published about 1983 chess. Black played f5. Now in that game in chess, I think white probably went d5. Now the point is, white can't play e takes f5 here because of bishop takes g2. Then after queen h5 check, black can just play king f8. If you recall, or au fait with the gambit line, this is one of the reasons why white's knight c3 is not recommended, because when black pins with bishop b4, it allows his king to go to f8. However, of course, Chandler's method is not bad, and he here produced a new move, which was knight to h3. I think in a later round against Prasad we had a different variation, but that followed game Granite Basman up to about move 15 or 20, and yeah, it's probably not of theoretical significance. The game Granite Basman has been published in the book Play the St. George. Now after knight h3 there were lots of possibilities for me. I'm pretty sure I chose one of the worst. Maybe I could have gone bishop takes e4 followed by knight to f6. Or maybe knight f6 was the best. I think possibly knight f6 might have been the best move, and after e5 black could put his knight in on e4, I should think. He could possibly play bishop takes g2, but then after e takes f6, bishop takes h1. I don't think I like black's position, so e5, maybe knight to e4 would be okay for black. Now, I didn't play knight f6. I played pawn takes on e4. And Chandler castled. No, Chandler didn't castle actually, did he? He played a direct attack. If he'd have castled, I'd have played knight f6. Instead he played queen h5 check. Rather a sharp move, and it's quite a difficult one to meet when the opponent is always pressing you with tactical problems right from the earlier part of the game. Of course, I wanted to go g6, but then I noticed that after queen e5, hitting the rook, knight f6, queen takes e6 check. Well, white's won a pawn, and don't see black has clear compensation. So instead of g6, I played king f8, and Chandler went knight g5. Now, again, g6 is possible, but I didn't like it after queen h4, so instead I played knight h6. Now Chandler castled, and I played rook to a5 here. This is to put the bead on the white pieces all lined up along the fifth row. Rook a5 was quite a good move, and it caused Chandler to think for some time before he eventually did capture the pawn at e4. Knight g5 takes e4, and here I don't think c6 is very good for black. It apparently wins a piece, but it doesn't really, I don't think. Yeah, the fact is white can just smash up black's position with bishop takes h6. So instead black has to move his knight. He plays knight h6 to f5, hitting the d4 pawn, and white now chose an interesting move, knight to c5. Once again, there are lots of little tactics to be worked out for black, and of course the b7 bishop is threatened. I don't really want to take the knight on c5, because then he'll take back with his d pawn, and I won't be able to take it anymore because it won't be on d4. So white also got some sort of threat here, playing bishop takes d7, and if knight takes d7, then knight takes e6 check. However, I decided that wasn't a real threat and dropped my bishop back to a8. And I was prepared for bishop takes d7, black playing bishop takes c5 in reply, white playing bishop takes e6, threatening mate on f7, black going g6. And then after white plays queen e2, black can play knight takes d4. White plays queen e5, and black can actually win the white queen now by knight f3 check, bishop takes f2 check, and rook takes e5. So all in all, after this knight to c5 move, bishop a8 looked okay. However, as matters turned out, it was not okay, and we later decided, or at least Chandler said, that bishop takes g2 didn't work either, he said, in the game. Actually, bishop takes g2, when we analysed, we found out it did work, because after king takes g2, black can now play bishop takes c3. Now the point is, if the white now captures with his pawn, black can now take the bishop with the rook. What Chandler had intended was that after black plays bishop takes c3, white could now move in with his knight onto b7, knight to b7, a little fork. And at this point, things look grim. However, black has the move queen h4, and everything is once again rosy, because if white exchanges the queens, black takes back with check, and there are enough white pieces hanging around the board for black to capture, and eventually the position ends up with material equality, certainly not worse for black. So bishop takes g2 here looked like held the balance for black. As the game went, after bishop a8, white found a different mode of progress. He played bishop to g5, hitting the black queen, which went to c8. And then, once again, white has possibilities of bishop takes d7 and knight takes e6 check, but they aren't really good. So instead, white played a very strong move, a4, which positionally is very hard for black to meet, because his rook is going to get shut out of the game. Therefore, I'm not quite sure what I should have done here, but things were not good. I played the move knight takes d4, which was my intention because it recovers my pawn. But after bishop to e3, we're no longer very happy. I can't, unfortunately, play the move I intended. Knight takes b5, a takes b5, and then d6, because white then chops the rooks on the a file and brings his rook to a1, and all my pieces are stacked up on the a file, and I just haven't got enough time to bring them back in. Well, it's still not clear what is so disastrous about black's position. Big problem is that after bishop e3, if black can't go back to take the bishop on b5, he has to go back to f5, and then white plays simply knight to b3, which I believe is what occurred, and black's rook has been trapped. Well, I had to give up the exchange, and the game was eventually lost. Now, in this game, I think we can conclude that it was the player, not the music, which was at fault. There were two after white's knight h3. I think black maybe didn't have to play f takes e4. That was risky. But even f takes e4 would have been okay if the sharp move bishop takes g2 had been found. Now we'll look at another St. George game. This was a game with Hodgson, who was a very strong attacking player, and he introduced a new method of attacking the St. George, and we'll see how this one went. If we start again, white played e4, e6, d4, a6, knight f3, b5, bishop d3, I went c5, c3, bishop b7, white castled, black went knight f6. And white here played rook e1, and the move which I've recommended usually is to play h6 here. Bishop e7 is also possible, but maybe h6, because the bishop may have to move anywhere when white plays d takes c5, so we want to move it a bit later. Eventually we've got to move it though, because otherwise white's going to push d5 sometime. So h6, white now went knight bd2, and black still can't play knight c6. This is one of the problems of the system. When can you play knight c6? Well, you can't play it here because white hits you with d5. Then if you take, he takes back discovered check, and you're ruined. So after knight bd2, black plays bishop e7. And here, instead of playing knight f1, which was a move played by Hodgson and short in earlier times. Instead, white played queen e2 here. Oh no, he didn't. No, he didn't play queen e2. First he hit with a4. And black played b4. And now white played this move queen e2. And this put me into some quagmires because I want to play knight c6, but I think it's one of those cases when you can't. Because after d5, black plays pawn takes, white plays pawn takes d5, and black plays knight takes d5. Now it looks like black's okay because his bishop on e7 is defended many times. But watch these defenders just disappear. White plays knight to c4, which threatens knight to d6 check. Black plays queen c7. He could also castle, but I don't think that makes it any different. So black plays queen c7, white plays bishop e4. And now after black moves his knight, say to b6 or f6, then white plays bishop takes knight, and if black plays bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop is mate. Or if black plays pawn takes bishop, white can now play bishop to f4, and again queen takes bishop, no good because of queen takes e7 check. So I looked at these variations quite for a long time, trying to find some way where I could play this knight c6 move, but I couldn't find one. So I chose a different plan, which was to play pawn takes c3, b4 takes c3, white b2 takes c3, and now knight. No, I could have gone knight c6 now, that would be possible. The point is, after all these moves, d5 and pawn takes, knight takes d5, I'll be hitting the c3 pawn with my knight at d5. This will give me an extra tempo. I think the reason I didn't play this line was because after knight c6, white could go rook b1. However, it seems that knight a5 is adequate for black. Now, however, I chose, as I said, a different plan. I took off on c3, and then when white recaptured, I took on d4. He recaptured, and now I played knight c6. White played rook b1. I went knight to b4. And this was the point of black's maneuver. By the exchanges of pawns, he's been able to get himself an outpost, a good outpost for the knight of b4. Now Hodgson played his own now patent advance against the St. George. He played d5. I played pawn takes d5, and now instead of capturing, which isn't much good, because black would recapture with the bishop and then put it on e6, Hodgson played e5. And the idea of this is to sort of block up the bishop at b7 and also get himself an outpost square at d4, and also possibly he'll be able to move his knight into f5, which could be a very awkward attacking thing. However, in this position black played knight h7, white went knight d4, black went knight to g5. Now during the game I thought white could go f4, knight e6, knight to f3, one from d2 to f3, but I think black can possibly quickly react with bishop c5 and liquidate a lot of stuff possibly. That should be okay, I think. In the actual game, Hodgson didn't play f4, he played knight f5, starting to wheel in on the black position. g7 is threatened, also possibly knight d6 check is threatened, which is going to be a catastrophe. But now just in time black plays knight e6, and everything again is guarded, and I think this position is now stabilized and black is okay. Hodgson now played the move knight to f1. I played a5 to support the knight at b4, give it a nice spot. Hodgson went knight to g3. Once again there are threats of moving in on the f5 square, but black's next move is a good one, g6. White can't really play knight takes h6 here because of bishop to g5, and black's game is then looking good. After bishop to g5, there are also threats of black exchanging. White could play knight to g4, so after bishop, and then he's threatening knight f6 check things. But black could then play bishop takes c1, and then move his other knight into f4, forking the white queen and bishop at d3. And even though white might get a check in on f6 check, he seems to be losing a piece on d3. So this variation isn't good for white, and he decided to take the other course, which is to go knight to d6 check instead of knight takes h6. Black played bishop takes d6. White played pawn takes d6. Black can't yet castle because his h6 pawn was hanging, so he played queen to h4. And still looking good for black. He's a pawn up. White hasn't got any avenues. If he tries things like bishop b2, black could castle, and after queen to e5, black could play f6 even, or even possibly king h7. So direct attacks don't seem to succeed. All the same, Hodgson isn't the sort of person to give up quickly, and he played the move bishop to b5. Now I think at this point I began to play weakly. Probably I should have played rook c8 or d4 maybe. What I did choose was bishop to a6, entering into tactics which went against me. He took on a6, and I took with the rook. And now what I had intended was, if white plays rook takes knight, queen takes rook, and then queen takes rook on a6, I could then capture his rook on e1. Well, so far so good. However, this isn't what actually happened. White did not take on b4. Instead, he played a really strong move, f4. And this brought in two threats into the game. Not just rook takes knight now, but also f5, which would bring his knight from g3, which had so far been rather limited by the black pawns, back into action. Now here I was so disturbed by this threat of f5, which I believe actually would now give white the advantage. Say if I played, which is maybe best, rook c6, white could go f5, pawn takes, knight takes, and now queen f6 is answered by bishop to b2, so queen e4. Maybe white goes queen f1. He could get his pawn back, but you could go queen f1, black goes queen to g4. This position is certainly worse than it was for black. He has got some advantages in his position, but I suppose it was rather annoying that the white knight on g3 had come back into the game. Okay, that anyway, it certainly wouldn't have been as bad as what actually happened, because after f4 I played rook takes d6, looking at the line, thinking that after f5 I'd be able to castle and give up a piece for 3 pawns. However, after rook takes d6, white just played queen e5, forking 2 rooks, and I might as well have resigned at that point. Okay, another defeat for the player, but a victory for the St. George. Now, in the final round of the British, I played a person called Cummings, and this was also a St. George, same main line, but a different approach. It went e4, e6, d4, a6, knight f3, b5, bishop d3, c5, c3, bishop b7, castles, knight f6, rook e1, and once again I played h6. Now Cummings now played knight d2, and I played bishop e7. Now, instead of keeping the pawns abreast at e4 and d4, Cummings now came forward with e5. I'm wondering if knight h7 is a possible move in this position to bring the knight round to g5 later. It might be in some ways more purposeful, though the knight at d5 has a good post as well. So anyway, I went to d5 with the knight, and he took on c5. I took back with the bishop. His knight came to e4. The bishop went to e7. This is all as in, now I've forgotten the name, but it was in the one of the first St. George books, the ones that went with the tapes. And in that position, Black had an awkward game because he had a knight, I think, on c6 instead of a pawn on h6, and White was later able to bring his bishop to g5. So the pawn on h6 does prevent this bishop g5 maneuver. Now White here, I was looking at the position, I thought maybe White could play something like c4 here. I think I was a little bit worried about it. I wonder if it's such a good idea. Possibly I could take, or maybe, and then go knight b6. Or possibly knight b4 might be an idea. If he takes on b5, take on d3, queen takes, pawn takes pawn, queen takes b5. Now at this point, one wonders if Black has got any compensation for his pawns. It isn't exactly clear what he has got. So after c4, maybe actually Black takes on c4, White takes with the bishop, and Black possibly goes knight b6, bishop back to d3. Or maybe Black could go bishop d5 here. This is possible. Or knight c6 might be an idea. Okay, we're not sure about c4. We'll look at what actually was played, which was a4. And this is a natural move, because if Black now pushes down with b4, White would then play pawn to c4, driving the knight from the d5 square. So in this position, it's probably better to do as Black did, which was to take on a4. Pawn takes a4. Now if White plays c4, Black will have a knight to b4 move. So instead, White played bishop to c2. This was, we're now in new territory, bishop c2. This position hasn't really been played before. I chose knight to c6, and White played rook takes a4. Now after the game, during the game, I think I was a bit worried that White might suddenly swing his rook over to the king side, but if he does that, he would need to first move his knight away, and this might get him out of position. So after the game, we looked at a5 as a possible move for Black. It didn't look like a bad idea, a5. I actually chose to play knight b6, which was a very risky attempt to cause trouble. Knight b6, White went rook a1, Black went knight c4, threatening now to win the pawn on e5. If bishop f4, I think Black could go g5. So White now played knight d6 check. I suppose he could also play something like knight d2 or knight g3. But knight d6 check, sorry, he didn't go knight d6 check, of course he didn't, no. Knight d6 check wouldn't have been so good. Black would have taken and then played bishop f6. No, instead White played pawn to b3, which was a very good pawn sacrifice, quite an obvious one. Now b3, Black took, knight takes e5, White played knight takes e5, Black played knight takes e5, White played knight d6 check, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and now Black played knight to c6. White went bishop to a3, Black went rook to c8. If we look at this position, the White compensation, which is two bishops, plus good control of the Black squares, and the Black king stuck in the center, the compensation is pretty good for White. Black has to play very carefully. But it's certainly not clear if it's a winning compensation. If Black can hold on, then this extra pawn may tell. Now White's next move was a good one, rook to e3, not just guarding the c3 pawn, but threatening to put his rook on g3, which attacks g7, and then also defending g2, because Black is always trying to get some mating threats on the g2 square. So rook e3 was a strong move. Black played queen c7. White queen went back to d1. d2 was also possible, I think. Black played knight e7. Now here, also interesting position. White could have gone, say, queen d4 here. But I thought black would probably go d5 in that case. And if white took on g7, black could go... No, black wouldn't go d5, would he? He was going to do something else. We've got to think of something. Now let's look at this move d5. Queen takes g7, rook g8, queen takes h6. Now black would like to take on g2, but he's put his pawn on d5, and so it's not really on. Well, he could try things like rook takes g2 and d4 check. Maybe possible. Yeah. Also possible might be d4. White rook g3. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. That's h pawn takes rook. Now queen takes c3 maybe. That does hit a lot of white pieces. The rook at a1 and the bishop at c2. So maybe white goes something like rook c1, something nice and crude. Well, what could black do here? Could play d3, though I'm not sure what happens after queen f6, threatening mates and things. Well, the position isn't too clear. Let's go back to that position after white played queen d4. So let's play queen d4. Black's gone d5. White could also go rook g3 instead of taking on g7, but then black could go e5, and his position looks okay. So this was a murky line. Instead of playing queen d4, though, Cummings played a different move. He played c4. No, he didn't. He played rook g3, threatening the pawn at g7. Now here I think my best is queen e5, and the position is at the moment not very clear. Maybe white goes queen d2 and rook e1. But after queen d2, maybe d5 again. Black's still clinging on to his extra pawn, so we're not sure if he's really dead at all. After rook g3, however, I decided to play some tactics. I went knight d5, c4, queen e5 now. Now white could take on d5, but then rook takes c2 is good for black. However, the simple move that white chose, which was queen e1, was quite enough to regain his pawn and get him the better position. Black played queen takes e1, rook takes e1, knight f4, rook takes g7, now d5, that was a blunder. This was because white just played rook g4, knight h5, and now bishop to b2, and the knight's trapped. So I played king e7, giving up the exchange, but the position was pretty hopeless. Now that was a pretty stern test of the St. George, but I think I've shown there were chances for black in that as well. Now there's some very interesting games in the Bishop E2 Sicilian. One of them was against Evans, and this had an innovation. E4, c5, white went bishop e2 here, maybe knight f3 is also possible, but it transposes anyway. Black played knight c6, white knight f3, black knight to f6, white e5. Black went knight g4, and now because the pawn on e5 is doomed, white went b4. And the idea is if black takes with c takes b4, white goes d4, supports the center, and then drives the knight at b4 away into the edge. However, black instead played d6, the recommended move to destroy the white center. Now in this situation, white can avoid losing a pawn by playing e takes d6. Black plays pawn takes on b4, and now white takes on e7. But this only really helps the black development, so I thought of a new move to jam up the works of the black position, and this was to play the move e6. Here, if black takes with the pawn, white would take on c5, and then if black takes back, then the two king pawns in the middle of the board should get somewhat in the way of the black pieces. They're doubled anyway. Instead, black tried to keep his pawn structure intact by playing bishop takes e6, and now white played knight to g5, which threatens, of course, to win a piece. However, black was prepared for this. He played queen d7. And there was an interesting variation here, which I considered for some time, which was knight takes e6, queen takes e6, and white castles. Black now plays queen e5, threatening the rook on a1 and mate on h2. White plays bishop takes g4, and black takes on a1 with his queen. And now white brings his knight out to c3. Now this is promising looking, but I decided after black plays c takes b4 and white goes knight to d5, black could go king to d8. And now I didn't see a good continuation for white to justify his exchange loss. I thought black would eventually get out of this. So after black's queen d7, I didn't take on e6. Instead I played first the pawn capture, which is b4 takes c5. White now played d6. Sorry, black played d6 takes c5. And now I decided I might as well I could have castled, but maybe black plays bishop f5 then. Instead I decided to play a direct move, knight takes e6, queen takes e6, and now I castled as white. Right, at this point it's no longer so good for black to play queen e5 and queen takes a1, because then after knight to c3 at the end of it, black's queen definitely is trapped. White will just have to move his queen away and his bishop away to trap the queen. And even if the black queen escapes, the black king is very much in danger. So black would almost certainly be lost in that case. Therefore, black didn't play queen e5, and I believe his best move was to retreat with his gains, go back to f6 with his knight. And he's got an extra pawn. In exchange, white has got the two bishops, some dangerous play on the white squares, and black will take some time to get his king into safety. He's got to play moves like g6, bishop g7, and castles. So, and white may be able to get some attacks going with rook e1, hidden attacks on the queens, knight c3 to b5. Looking at the position, I didn't see anything definitely clear for white, but maybe some listeners will find a good continuation here after. What would white do after black played knight f6? I think white has enough compensation, it's just I didn't find a clear line. Now, instead of knight f6, black considered his position was a very strong attacking position and played h5. This is a very faulty move. And as we'll see soon, white just played knight c3, black played queen e5, and white went g3. Now the attack with knight takes h2 and h4 looks attractive for black, but really you can't expect to do much with only a couple of pieces. The attack, white would just go king to g2, and eventually the attack would fizzle. And this was black's trouble. He could never really get his attack to work. He could never get the files opened without too much sacrifice of material. Still, he was undeterred and just castled queenside. And white, of course, put his rook on b1. White already has got an open file. Black played e6. White played bishop f3. Black played bishop e7. Now and again a straightforward move. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, queen to f3. Black played queen c7. And white now played queen takes f7. This is again straightforward. regaining the pawn and also threatening to play queen takes e6 check. Black played rook h6, d3, discovering an attack on the rook, rook f8, queen takes g7. Black is being harassed by these moves that he has no time really to get his own attack going. He had to play rook h6 back to h8, and now white considered knight e4, but more direct and stronger was the move played, which is bishop f4. Unfortunately, black can't play rook takes f4 because the queen takes h8 check. So he had to go e5, which blocks many of his lines, and he can't use the e5 square now for his knight. So e5, white played bishop to g5. Bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. Black's position is still terrible. His pawn structure is awful. His king is worse off than white's, and this e4 square is going to be very good for white knight. So black now tried to play. He played rook to. What did he play? He played. What if he played rook to g8? White would have just checked and continued with his attack. So he decided to go for the attack now, such as it was. Knight takes h2, king takes h2, h4. White went queen g4 check, king to d1, king round to g2 by white, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. And now black moved his rook from f8 to g8. White played queen to f3, which was the signal for black to resign, which he did. Now players of the Bishop E2 Sicilian, after they play e4, may wonder what to do against the French. We've never really found a good attacking line. Now here's one which I played against Not in the British, and it went e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, e5. So black's played the Renava variation, and now black played c5. Now in the past I played bishop d2 followed by knight to b5, but this is a fairly quiet line, and I'm not sure if I like it that much anymore. Also the move a3, which is the main line, I don't like that either. So instead I chose to play d takes c5. This doesn't waste a move on playing a3, because basically if black wants to take the knight on c3, he's going to one day, so why encourage him? So d takes c5, the idea is to get a more open game, because you're going to get the two bishops one day, and so you want the position to be open, and then you relieve the pressure on d4 so as you can concentrate on maintaining e5, or if e5 does go, at least you might, as I say, get open diagonals. So d takes c5, Not played knight e7. I think I was worried that he might go knight c6, knight f3, queen c7, but he said after the game that that's one of the lines, main lines of this variation. Not that I knew it was a variation. And he said white can then go moves like bishop d2, and if knight takes e5, something like knight to b5, and the knight comes in on d6. Well, that's as maybe that's an idea to be looked at. I suppose white could also do other moves like bishop b5 and castles. But anyway, instead Not played knight e7 after d takes c5, and I just continued now to support the e pawn. Knight f3. Black now went knight c6, knight b8 to c6, white bishop d3, and here he said again if knight g6, maybe bishop d2 and knight to b5, I think. Now, or no, actually after knight g6, if black plays to knock off the e pawn, white will castle, and then he's threatening moves like knight b5. So it looks like he might get compensation for his pawn. Now here Not chose a different move. He went d4, and this wins him eventually a pawn. a3, bishop a5, b4, knight takes b4, pawn takes b4, bishop takes b4. White castled. bishop takes c3, rook to b1. This is really the position that white wants. He's pawn down, but his game is active. He has maintained e5. Black here played knight c6, white queen e2, black went queen c7, white played bishop f4, and now there's a threat of knight to g5, followed by moving it round to d6, so black played h6. White played knight to d2 here, and really black should have taken that knight off. His bishop at c3 is quite useless. I mean, this game is very unusual that black actually had two bad bishops in the game, not one. I mean, it's criminal of him not to take on d2, which would have led to an unclear position. Instead, he went and castled, after which white gleefully played knight c4, and black now played... no, actually white didn't go knight c4, he went queen e4 threatening mate g6, then knight c4. Black went king g7, and now white hammered in his knight onto d6. Black here played queen to e7. Now white's position is really marvellous here, and he was even able to play a good tactical move for once in his life. I sometimes make good tactical moves. h4. Now here, if queen takes h4, white can now play knight takes f7 and smash through on g6. So it looks like the pawn cannot be captured, and it's going to do a lot of damage when it comes up to h5. So faced with this horrendous threat, I mean, black could also play something like bishop to b4 here, but white would just play rook takes bishop and then h5, and black will not defend this attack. So instead black played f5, white played e takes f6, black played rook takes f6. Now a strong move from white, bishop to e5. This loses the strong white bishop, but on the other hand it suppresses the black position very badly. Knight takes bishop, queen takes knight. Now white has some threats of knight e4, but on the other hand, what can black do? He played here bishop to a5, preparing to give up the exchange if necessary. I mean, he has got a pawn also. But instead white just continued the attack with h5. Black can't play pawn takes h5 because of knight to f5 check. So instead he went bishop to c7, and white now continued with pawn takes... no, he played bishop takes on g6, regaining his pawn, and the black position is getting shredded. Black played b6. I wonder what you think white will do here. What do you think is white's best move? Well, knight f5 check isn't really very good because both queens are on prise, and the simple move knight e8 check keeps the white advantage. Knight e8 check, queen takes knight, queen takes bishop check, bishop d7. White went queen to g3. Sorry, actually black didn't go bishop d7, he went queen d7 of course, didn't he? And then queen to g3 with a threat of discovered check. Now black saw that and played bishop to b7. Actually he should have gone king h8. I mean, he was only looking at bishop e4 discovered check. He went bishop to b7, which allowed bishop e8 discovered check, and this won the black queen, so he resigned immediately. He should have gone king h8, but then white can win a pawn and have the superior position by simply c takes b6. So you might like to try this attacking line against the French defense. D takes c5 is a good idea. Well, thanks for listening to this tape. I hope you now have some attacking lines against the CARO-KANN, the French, and the Sicilian. And of course there is the Tayler variation, which can be used against e4, e5. Incidentally, I played the Tayler variation against Hebden again. This went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, knight f6, d4 takes on d4, e5, knight e4. White castled, now d5, and this time I played knight takes d4. Last time I played bishop takes f4. Now if black takes on e5, white can go f3, and now if knight to f6, rook e1 is suggested, and also against knight d6, a new young player, I think called Harley, suggests rook e1, and this leads to good play for white. If bishop e7, white can go bishop b5 check, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, black knight goes to g6, and now queen takes d5. Now if queen takes d5, knight takes c7 check. So black castles. Now white plays knight b1 to c3, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, bishop c5 check, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, and now if c6, white can play knight to d6, and maybe he's got a slight edge there. Now in the game against Hedden, black didn't risk knight takes e5 after knight takes d4. He played instead knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and then bishop c5, queen d3, and here he castled. I chose here knight c3, but after knight takes c3, queen takes c3, queen e7, bishop f4, bishop f5, queen g3. The position was eventually ended up with equality, because black chose to play later queen e6, threatening to go queen to g6. So we must look for improvements in this line for white to stop black getting away with a draw.